The grand estate of Eleanor Whitmore had not known a single quiet morning in nearly 8 months. The iron gates, the marble floors, the high ceilings designed to impress visiting executives, none of it mattered when the sound of 2 children screaming tore through every room like a storm that refused to pass. 50 nannies had walked through that front door, each one confident, credentialed, and prepared. 50 nannies had walked back out, some in tears, some in shock, one with a bite mark on her forearm and a look in her eyes that said she would never speak of this place again. The billionaire who controlled 3 tech subsidiaries and sat on the board of 2 international investment firms could not control the 2 most important people in her life. And the world, her world, was beginning to notice. Then one afternoon, a man with worn boots and a quiet daughter arrived to fix a broken pipe. No one expected anything from them. No one could have prepared for what happened next. You will not believe what that child did, and why it made the entire estate fall completely silent. Eleanor Whitmore was 27 years old, and already the subject of profiles in 3 major financial publications. She had built her first company at 22, sold it at 24, and used the capital to launch Whitmore Tech Solutions, which had grown into a firm managing assets that most people could not count without losing track of the zeros. She wore her power the way others wore expensive coats, naturally, without effort, as though it had always belonged to her. Her hair was always pulled back. Her voice was always measured. She never raised it in a boardroom, never let her expression break during a negotiation, and had once sat through a hostile acquisition meeting for 11 hours without requesting a single break. Her twins, Lucas and Luna, had been born 3 days after her 22nd birthday. Their father had left before they turned 2, quietly, without a scene, the way men sometimes leave when they realize the woman beside them does not actually need them. Eleanor had raised the children alongside a rotating staff of caregivers, which had seemed, at the time, like a perfectly efficient solution. She was busy. The work mattered. The children were provided for in every material sense that the word allowed. Lucas was 5 years old, and built like a small storm, given human form. He had his mother's dark eyes and his absent father's restless energy, and when something upset him, the entire room knew within seconds. He did not cry the way ordinary children cried. He screamed, full and raw and relentless, a sound that had driven 3 separate nannies to give notice within their first week. He threw things not in a calculated way, but in a desperate way, as though the object in his hand was the only language available to him. Tablets, stuffed animals, once a ceramic bowl that shattered against a window frame and sent 2 members of the household staff running for the door. Luna was quieter, but no less intense. She was the kind of child who watched everything from the corner of her eye, and then, without warning, collapsed into a panic so complete and so consuming that no amount of soothing words or gentle hands could reach her. She did not want to be touched during those moments. She did not want to be spoken to. She pulled her knees to her chest and rocked in a rhythm that seemed to come from somewhere very deep, and anyone who tried to intervene only made it worse. The 50 nannies had come from agencies that specialized in difficult children, in neurodivergent children, in high-maintenance households. Some had brought specialized training and lengthy references. One had worked for a European royal family. Another had a graduate degree in child development and a calm, clinical manner that had lasted exactly 9 days before she submitted her resignation by email at 4 in the morning. The note had been professional. The tone had been defeated. It read, "I wish the children well, but I am not equipped for this, and I do not believe anyone is." The child psychologist's Eleanor had produced reports full of careful language sensory sensitivity, attachment disruption, emotional dysregulation, without producing anything resembling a solution. They recommended structured routines, which Eleanor implemented. They recommended low-stimulation environments, which Eleanor created. The children continued to scream. Eleanor continued to sit alone in her office at night, staring at the closed door of their bedroom, listening to the silence after they finally exhausted themselves into sleep, and feeling something she had never allowed herself to feel before, helpless. She did not show it during the day. Eleanor Whitmore did not show helplessness. She showed competence, she showed authority, and when something was broken, she hired the most qualified person available to fix it. But this was not something that could be fixed by a resume or a certification. And somewhere beneath the precision and the control, she was beginning to The rumors began the way rumors always begin in wealthy circles, quietly, passed between people at dinners and charity functions in a tone that pretended to be concerned, but was really something closer to satisfied. Word spread that Eleanor's twins were unmanageable, that she had gone through 50 caregivers, that the children had driven away professionals who had never failed before. A colleague who sat beside her at a quarterly review leaned in and mentioned, with exaggerated sympathy, that there were excellent residential programs for children with behavioral challenges. Eleanor smiled. She thanked him for the information. Under the table, she pressed her thumbnail into her palm until the pain gave her something else to concentrate on. The investors were more subtle but no less pointed. A representative from a Singapore-based fund sent a carefully worded message suggesting that personal instability sometimes reflected on professional judgment and that the board would welcome any reassurance Eleanor could offer. She wrote back the same afternoon, citing her firm's quarterly returns, the projected growth trajectory, and the 3 pending contracts that would expand their market share significantly. The message was received. Nothing more was said directly, but Eleanor noticed, in the weeks that followed, a certain coolness in the room during calls, a slight hesitation before decisions were made, a quality of watchfulness that had not been there before. She hired 4 more nannies in quick succession, each vetted more thoroughly than the last. The first lasted 3 weeks. The second lasted 11 days. The third quit after 5 days and filed a formal complaint with her agency, citing an unsafe working environment, which was perhaps fair, given that Lucas had thrown a water bottle at her head with surprising accuracy, and Luna had screamed for 4 consecutive hours during what was supposed to be a therapeutic art session. The fourth did not even make it to the end of her trial week. She left during the twins' afternoon quiet time, placed her keycard on the kitchen counter, and walked out without speaking to anyone. Eleanor sat in her kitchen that evening, with a glass of water she had not touched, looking at the keycard on the counter, and decided that she was not going to call another agency. She did not know what she was going to do instead. She just knew that whatever she had been trying was not working, and that continuing to do the same thing while expecting a different result was a particular kind of failure she had never allowed herself in business and could no longer afford in her personal life. What she did not know was that the answer was already scheduled to arrive on Thursday morning, in the form of a work order for a broken pipe in the East Wing utility room. Caleb Dawson was 32 years old, and had the kind of face that people forgot immediately in a crowd, not because it was unpleasant, but because it was quiet. He had brown hair that was a little too long, careful gray eyes that missed nothing, and hands that were permanently stained around the knuckles from years of working with pipes and joints, and the particular kind of grime that came with knowing how buildings actually functioned from the inside out. He drove a truck that was 12 years old, and made a noise on left turns that he kept meaning to address, and kept not getting around to. He had grown up in a small town, an hour outside the city, and had learned his trade from his uncle, who had believed firmly that a man who could fix things would never go hungry. Caleb had proved this theory correct, if only just. He worked steady enough maintenance contracts, emergency calls, the occasional renovation project, but steady did not mean comfortable, and comfortable was not something his life had produced in the past 3 years. His wife, Margaret, had died when Ella was 3 years old. A car accident on a highway in February. Black ice on a curve she had driven dozens of times without incident. The details were clean and simple, in the way that the worst kinds of loss often were, stripped of any comfort by their plainness. There had been no dramatic farewell, no final conversation, no chance to prepare. One evening she was there, and by the next morning she was not, and Caleb had been left standing in a hospital corridor, holding a 3-year-old girl, who kept asking for her mother in a voice so small, it barely made a sound. He had learned to carry it. That was the only way to describe what he did with the grief. He did not process it in any visible sense, did not speak of it often, did not make it the center of his identity. He carried it the way a man carries a pack on a long walk, always aware of the weight, adjusted for it, moving forward anyway because there was a child beside him who needed him to keep moving. Ella was 6 years old, and had her mother's wide dark eyes and her father's stillness. She was not shy in the clinical sense. She did not hide behind Caleb's legs when strangers appeared or refused to answer questions. She was simply quiet in a way that ran deeper than most children's silence. She observed. She waited. She had a sense of when a room held tension that most adults did not notice, and she responded to it not by withdrawing but by becoming very, very still, as though stillness itself were a kind of shelter. She carried a stuffed rabbit everywhere she went. It had been white once, years ago, Before it had been washed so many times, the color had faded to a soft gray, and one of its embroidered eyes had loosened until it sat slightly lower than the other, giving the rabbit an expression of gentle, lopsided attention. Ella called it Warren. She had never explained why. Caleb had never asked. He brought her along on jobs when school was out, and his usual sitter was unavailable, which was more often than he liked. She was good at it, stayed out of the way, sat quietly with her rabbit and a book or just her own thoughts, never complained. The household staff at the Whitmore estate gave them both a look when they arrived that Thursday morning, the kind of look that conveyed, without words, that a man with stained knuckles and a child in tow did not quite fit the standard of the premises. Caleb noticed it and said nothing. Ella noticed it and pressed Warren a little more firmly against her chest, but her expression did not change. The housekeeper, a woman named Vera who had worked for Eleanor for 4 years and moved through the house with the quiet authority of someone who had survived everything it had thrown at her, led Caleb to the utility room without conversation and left him to his work. She told him the parts list, the acceptable hours, and that under no circumstances were he or the child to enter the west wing. Caleb thanked her, set his bag down, and got to work. Ella sat in the hallway just outside the utility room with Warren in her lap, her back against the wall, her legs straight out in front of her. She had a small book she was not really reading. She was listening to the house, the sounds of it, the creaks and the distant hum of climate control, and the muffled quality of a large space that was trying very hard to contain something it could not quite hold. She heard them before she saw them. The sound came from the direction Vera had told them to avoid, a high, thin wail that rose and broke and rose again, followed by a lower, rhythmic banging that she recognized instinctively as something being struck against a hard surface, over and over, not in anger exactly, but in the relentless urgency of a body that needed the world to stop being so much. Ella looked down the hallway. She looked at Warren. She looked down the hallway again. She did not move toward the sound. She simply turned her head so she was facing it. The door at the end of the hall was not fully closed. Through the gap, she could see a sliver of a room, pale light, a bright rug, the edge of what might have been a bookshelf. And then, as the wailing shifted into something lower and more exhausted, she saw a face appear in the gap. Luna Whitmore, 5 years old, with tear-streaked cheeks and her mother's dark hair hanging loose around her face, stood at the barely opened door and looked down the hallway. She looked at Ella. Ella looked back. Neither of them moved. The crying had not stopped entirely. Lucas was still somewhere in the room behind Luna. The banging continuing in its desperate rhythm, but Luna herself had gone still. Not the stillness of calm, but the stillness of recognition, as though she had looked up from a very loud, very dark place, and seen something on the horizon that she could not name but somehow knew. Ella did not smile. She did not wave. She sat against the wall with Warren in her lap and simply held the gaze, the way you hold something fragile with both hands, without tightening your grip. The banging in the room slowed, then stopped. Vera appeared from around the corner. At the same moment, Eleanor Whitmore came down the main staircase, alerted by the sudden, unprecedented silence that had no precedent in 8 months of daily chaos. Both of them saw Ella at the same instant. Vera moved first, her voice low and sharp. "You need to come away from there, sweetheart." She took 3 quick steps toward the child, reaching out to move her back toward the utility room. Ella stood. She did not resist, but she kept her eyes on Luna's face until the last possible moment. And Luna, standing in the doorway of her room, knuckles white on the doorframe, kept her eyes on Ella. Then Vera's hand touched Ella's shoulder, and Luna made a sound. Not a scream. Not a cry. Something smaller and more precise. A single syllable that no one in the hallway could quite make out, but that carried in it, unmistakably, the quality of an objection. Eleanor was at the bottom of the stairs. She was looking at her daughter standing in the doorway of a room she had not voluntarily opened to a stranger in months. Luna's hands were still gripped on the frame. Her knuckles were still white, but her face was different. The tight, overwhelmed expression that had become so constant in the past year that Eleanor had almost forgotten her daughter's face could look any other way had loosened, just slightly, just at the edges, into something that might, in a different context, have been called curiosity. Eleanor looked at the child in the hallway. Small, still, with a faded gray rabbit held against her side, and an expression so calm it almost looked like concentration. "Wait," Eleanor said. Vera looked up. Caleb had appeared in the doorway of the utility room, wiping his hands on a cloth, assessing the situation with the quick, quiet attention of a man who had learned to read rooms fast. "Let me think," Eleanor said. And then, after a moment, to no one in particular, 5 minutes. Give it 5 minutes. No one argued with Eleanor Whitmore when she used that tone. The decision felt reckless, and she knew it felt reckless, and she made it anyway, which was perhaps the first genuinely impulsive thing Eleanor had done in 3 years. She told Vera to stand back. She told Caleb, who had already moved to collect his daughter, to wait. She looked at Ella directly for the first time and said, in a voice that was much softer than her usual register, "Would you like to go in?" Ella looked at her father. Caleb looked at Eleanor for a moment, reading her, the way he read structural damage, looking for the thing underneath the surface, and then he looked at his daughter. "Only if you want to, Elle," he said. Ella looked at the door. Luna was still there, still holding the frame, watching. Lucas had come to stand beside his sister, his earlier frenzy spent, his dark eyes fixed on the small girl in the hallway, with an expression that was very close to stillness. Ella walked forward. She did not hurry. She walked down the hall at the pace of someone who was not afraid and not performing bravery, simply moving towards something that made sense to her in a way she could not have explained. She reached the doorway and stopped. She looked at Lucas. She looked at Luna. Then she stepped into the room. She did not speak. She did not approach the twins. She crossed to the center of the room, where the bright rug spread out under a low table scattered with toys that no one had played with in days, and she sat down on the floor, cross-legged, Warren in her lap, her hands resting open at her sides. The room was not silent, it was holding its breath. From the hallway, Eleanor watched. Vera watched. Caleb stood at the edge of the doorframe, his cloth still in his hands, his expression carrying the particular careful neutrality of a man who was allowing his child to do something that required him to stand perfectly still and trust her. Ella reached into the front pocket of her small backpack and withdrew a second toy, a soft, small bear, worn around the ears from handling, and placed it beside Warren on the rug between herself and the twins. She did not look at Lucas or Luna directly after that. She looked at Warren. She began to stroke the rabbit's ears with one finger, slowly, in a steady, unhurried rhythm, and she made a sound barely audible, a low, soft hum, not a tune exactly, just a frequency, a warmth given breath and shape. Lucas sat down. It was not a dramatic collapse or a deliberate decision. He simply folded down onto the rug, 6 feet from Ella, like a body that had finally stopped fighting gravity. His breathing, which had been ragged, slowed. His hands, which had been fisted, opened. Luna took 3 steps. Then 2 more. She lowered herself to the rug on the opposite side of the small bear. She did not touch it. She looked at it. She looked at Ella. She looked at Warren, and then she reached out very slowly, with one small finger, and touched the ear of the soft bear Ella had placed between them. Ella kept humming. She did not react to the touch. She did not smile or make eye contact or do anything that might disturb the fragile architecture of this moment. She just kept her rhythm, steady and quiet. The sound of a room that had decided to be safe. Eleanor's hand had come up to cover her mouth. She was not aware of it happening. The silence that followed was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of something finally setting down. The twins sat on the rug with the 6-year-old daughter of a pipe fitter, and the furious, desperate energy that had consumed them for months, that had driven away 50 professionals and turned a $20 million estate into a place of daily chaos did not disappear, but it settled. It became manageable. It became, for the first time in longer than Eleanor could clearly remember, something other than a catastrophe. She did not understand what she had witnessed. Not yet. But she felt the truth of it in her chest, before she had the language to name it. Later that evening, after the twins had eaten dinner without incident for the first time in weeks, after they had gone to bed with something approaching willingness, after the house had achieved a quiet that felt earned rather than stolen, Eleanor found Caleb in the driveway, loading his tools back into his truck. Ella was already in the passenger seat, asleep against the window with Warren tucked under her chin. Eleanor stood on the front steps and looked at the man carefully. He met her gaze without flinching, without performing deference, without the stiff posture people adopted when they were trying to make themselves smaller in the presence of wealth. She asked him, "How does she do that?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. He set the last bag in the truck bed and closed the tailgate. "She doesn't do anything," he said. "She just doesn't panic." That was not the answer Eleanor had expected, and it stayed with her after he drove away, sat with her while she stood in the hallway outside the twins' room, turned in her mind the way a difficult problem turns when you are almost close to understanding it. She called him the next morning and asked if Ella could come back. It took Caleb most of that conversation to explain what Ella's first year after her mother's death had looked like. He did not use clinical language, and he did not dramatize it. He spoke simply, in the direct way of someone who had lived with a hard thing long enough to look at it without flinching. After Margaret died, Ella had gone through a period that the pediatrician had described in precise, careful terms: emotional dysregulation, hyperreactivity to stimulus, difficulty tolerating transitions, and that Caleb described in the only terms that made sense to him. She couldn't handle anything for a long time. The world was just too loud. He described what had eventually helped. Not therapy alone, though they had tried that. Not structured routine alone, though that had been part of it. What had helped was the discovery that Ella needed a rhythm, not a schedule, but a rhythm. Something slow and soft and predictable to anchor herself to when everything felt too fast. The rabbit had become part of that. The humming had become part of that. A consistent, gentle pattern that her nervous system could hold on to when the rest of the world was overwhelming. She had not been taught to do what she had done in that room, Caleb explained. She had simply recognized what the twins were feeling, because she had felt it herself, and she had done instinctively what had once calmed her own overwhelming moments. She had offered them a rhythm. Eleanor listened. She said nothing for a long time after he finished. Then she said, "The psychologists gave me reports. Nobody ever said it like that." "I'm not a psychologist," Caleb said. "No," Eleanor said, "you're not." The silence on the line stretched for a moment that was not uncomfortable. Eleanor was looking at something just beyond her office window, the east wing, the light in the children's room, the ordinary fact of mourning. "They're not broken," she said finally, and the words came out with a quality that suggested she was saying them to herself as much as to him. "They're just overwhelmed." "Yeah," Caleb said quietly. "That's the whole thing." She sat with that understanding for several days, and it was not a comfortable process. The realization that her children were not suffering from a behavioral disorder that required professional intervention so much as from a deeper, more fundamental isolation. An isolation she had built, brick by filling their lives with qualified strangers and scheduled activities and every material comfort that money could provide. While keeping herself carefully, professionally removed, was not something Eleanor could accept all at once. She came at it the way you come at a mirror in an unflattering light. Turning away, then back, then away again, and finally just standing there and looking. The board meeting that week was a problem. 3 investors wanted formal reassurance that her personal situation was not affecting her professional capacity. Her chief of staff presented a 40-slide deck demonstrating performance metrics, growth projections, and leadership stability. Eleanor sat at the head of the table and delivered it with perfect composure, and when one board member suggested, obliquely, that the children's situation might benefit from more structured institutional care, she looked at him with the expression that had once made a negotiating team from a rival firm physically leave the room. "That recommendation," she said, "is noted and declined." But the harder fight was not in the boardroom. It was in the moments that came after Ella began spending part of each day at the house, not as a nanny, not as therapy, simply as a small, calm presence who liked to sit on the floor and did not demand anything of anyone. Those moments when Eleanor stood outside the playroom door and watched her children slowly, incrementally, begin to settle. When she watched Ella place Warren on the rug and let the twins choose whether to approach, never reaching for them, never raising her voice, never making demands. When she watched Lucas, for the first time, pick up a toy and hand it to someone else without being asked. And the harder fight was in what watching all of that required of her. She began to come home earlier. This was not a dramatic or sudden decision. It happened in increments, leaving one meeting 10 minutes early, declining one dinner, taking one phone call from the car instead of the office. She began to sit on the playroom floor, not because she knew how to do what Ella did, she did not, but because she was starting to understand that the absence of her had been, in some way, the problem at the center of all the other problems. She did not lower her guard all at once. She lowered it the way ice thaws slowly, unevenly. Then all at once in a moment you almost miss. The breakthrough came at a fundraising gala. 4 weeks after Ella had first walked into the twins' room, Eleanor had made the mistake, or perhaps the decision she was not sure there was a difference anymore of bringing Lucas and Luna. They were old enough. The event was held at a hotel ballroom downtown, and the plan had seemed reasonable when she made it. Quiet corner table, familiar staff nearby, controlled environment. What she had not accounted for was the band. The band began playing at 7:30, and the volume, not extreme by adult standards, but sudden and bright. And filling the room from every direction at once, hit Lucas like a physical thing. He was out of his chair before anyone reacted. Not running, but rigid, his hands pressed over his ears. His face contracted into the particular expression Eleanor knew preceded a full episode. The guests nearest their table turned. Someone at the next table made a sound of alarm. Eleanor stood up. Her instinct, the instinct of 3 years of crisis management, of 50 nannies and psychiatry reports, and everything that had not worked, was to move toward him with authority. To manage the situation, to take control of what was happening and bring it back inside the lines. She took 2 steps forward, and then she stopped, because Ella was already there. Caleb had brought her at Eleanor's invitation, both of them seated a few chairs down the table, and Ella had slipped off her chair the moment Lucas moved. She crossed the small distance between them without rushing, sat down on the marble floor directly in front of him, and did what she always did. She placed Warren on the floor between them, took out the small bear, and began the gentle, steady rhythm, the hum, the unhurried movement, the whole architecture of calm that she had built from her own experience of being overwhelmed. The room was watching. 50, 60 people, glasses raised, conversation stilled. Lucas's hands came down from his ears, very slowly, by degrees, as though some interior pressure was slowly releasing. His breathing shifted. He looked at Warren on the floor. He looked at Ella. He sat down. On the marble floor of a downtown hotel ballroom, surrounded by people in evening wear and the low, resumed sound of conversation beginning again in uncertain waves, a 5-year-old boy sat cross-legged across from a 6-year-old girl, and the catastrophe did not happen. Eleanor stood and watched her son. She did not move to intervene. She did not speak. She stood very still, her hands at her sides, and felt something that she did not have an immediate word for, something that was part relief and part grief and part the particular, clean ache of understanding arriving too late to prevent a wound but not too late to begin healing it. She sat back down beside Luna, who had not moved from her chair, and was watching her brother with an expression that was steady and clear, and more composed than Eleanor had seen on her daughter's face in a very long time. Eleanor put her arm around her daughter. Luna leaned in, just slightly. And Eleanor held her breath, and held her ground, and kept her arm exactly where it was. In the weeks that followed, the house changed. Not in ways that would be visible to anyone who had not known it before. The marble floors were still marble, the east wing still east, the clock in the entrance hall still chiming on the hour. But the rooms felt different. The quality of the air had shifted. Eleanor's chief of staff noted, in a message she did not send but drafted and then deleted, that the principal had been leaving the office 30 minutes earlier on average, and had declined 4 non-critical evening engagements in the past month. The board continued to monitor. Eleanor continued to perform. The numbers remained strong, which was the language everyone understood. At home, she was learning a different language. She was learning to sit on the floor. She was learning that when Lucas made a sound that meant the world was getting too loud, the correct response was not to reduce the noise from the outside, but to offer him something to hold on to from the inside, a rhythm, a pattern, a person who stayed. She was learning that Luna did not need to be coaxed or reasoned with, but that she needed to be waited for, patiently and without agenda, the way you wait for something that is coming in its own time. She was learning, in other words, to be present. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, and it was not going well every day. And she was doing it anyway. She offered Caleb a formal position. She framed it professionally, described the compensation accurately, presented it as an employment arrangement for both maintenance oversight and supportive childcare assistance, language that sounded reasonable to her and probably, she acknowledged privately, missed the point entirely. Caleb listened. He thanked her. He said no. He said it without embarrassment or apology. In the same direct way he had told her that Ella didn't do anything. She just didn't panic. He said that Ella had school and he had work, and they had a life that was small but that was theirs, and that he didn't think folding it into someone else's structure would serve any of them well. He said it with a courtesy that made it clear he was not rejecting Eleanor personally, only the arrangement, and he said it with a certainty that suggested he had thought it through before she made the offer. Eleanor was quiet for a moment after he finished. She had expected to feel the particular irritation she felt when people declined her proposals, which was a rare enough occurrence that she had not yet learned to carry it gracefully. She did not feel that. She felt something that was closer to respect. "I understand," she said. And she meant it. They reached an agreement that suited both of them without requiring either to become something they were not. Ella continued to visit the twins 3 afternoons a week. Caleb continued to take the occasional maintenance call at the estate, because the plumbing in a building that size required regular attention, and he was good at it. The arrangement had no formal structure, no contract, nothing that could be filed or signed. It simply existed, the way the most durable things sometimes do, not because anyone designed it, but because it was the shape of what was actually needed. On a Tuesday in November, 6 months after Ella had first sat down on that bright rug with Warren in her lap, Eleanor came home at 4:30 in the afternoon, not because she had left work early, but because she had scheduled herself to leave at 4:30, the way she scheduled everything that mattered to her professionally, and she had decided that this was something that mattered to her. She found the 3 children in the garden behind the east wing. Lucas was sitting in the grass pulling up blades of it in a focused, methodical way. Luna was lying on her back looking at clouds. Ella was beside them with Warren propped against her knee, talking about something in a low voice that Eleanor could not hear from the doorway. She stood there for a moment before they noticed her. Lucas looked up first. He looked at her with his dark eyes, steady and calm, without the tight, braced expression that had become so familiar she had almost forgotten it was not his natural face. He held up a small bunch of grass. She raised her eyebrows. He grinned. It was a brief, sudden, unguarded thing, gone almost before she registered it, and it reached her somewhere she could not have described to any board or investor or journalist. She sat down in the grass. She was wearing a work skirt and good shoes, and she sat down in the grass anyway, and after a moment, Luna rolled over and put her head in Eleanor's lap, and after another moment Lucas moved closer and leaned against her arm, and Ella kept talking about whatever she had been talking about, her voice steady and gentle and unhurried. And Warren watched everything with his mismatched embroidered eyes. The estate was quiet, not the strained, exhausted quiet of collapse, not the temporary quiet of depletion, but the warm, inhabited quiet of a place where people were simply together and the world was, for the moment, exactly the right size. Eleanor did not move. She breathed. She looked at her children. She thought of nothing that needed to be solved or managed or improved, which was, for her, a kind of miracle. The most expensive thing she had ever purchased had been a private equity stake in a company that returned 400% in 3 years. The most valuable thing she had ever received arrived on a Thursday morning, with a 12-year-old truck and a worn gray rabbit, and a child who had learned, in the hardest possible way, that the only real solution to being overwhelmed was a person who stayed. Some answers cannot be hired. Some healings cannot be scheduled. And sometimes the thing that finally brings silence to a house that has known nothing but noise is not a credential, or a program, or a plan. It is just a child sitting on the floor, offering a rhythm to another child who had forgotten that stillness was possible, and the presence of someone who refuses to leave.